Hey everyone. So I just got a notification just a couple minutes ago that there is a new video. It is titled One D&D Survey Results and the Future of One D&D. I have been very interested to hear about the survey results. I didn't know if they were going to share them with us, so it sounds like that's what this is. So I'm going to be doing a reaction video, and if there's nothing substantial in this, I probably won't bother releasing this video, but assuming that they're going to tell us exactly what kind of results they're getting in these surveys, then I think that's super interesting information, and I thought I should do a reaction to it. So here we go.
So today for One D&D, I'm here with Jeremy Crawford, and we are talking about how One D&D is going, how the playtest is being received. We've got some scores, right? We know things now about how this process is going, correct?
Absolutely. So we have now had a chance to analyze the feedback to the very first Unearthed Arcana in this series, the Unearthed Arcana that was called Character Origins. We have compiled the satisfaction scores. Our staff has also combed through the written responses. And so we now have a very clear idea of how the D&D community responded to that first stage of this playtest process. And
Okay, so this is going to be the results to the first playtest, so not the expert classes playtest. And hopefully they'll do another video where they tell us the results of that survey, because I think that was an even more robust version of the 1D&D playtest than the first one. But the first one, remember, did have a lot of stuff that certainly has gotten a lot of attention online. The first one had the nat 20s. They would give you inspiration. That was a controversial one. The changes to critical hits, that was probably the biggest one. The ones being automatic failures, that was another one that got a lot of attention. So let's see. And I notice he says that they did read comments. I'm curious how many they got to read. He talked about over 40,000 responses, and that was a while ago. And I believe the survey was open a little while even after that, so it was probably more than that. There's no way they read every comment out of 40,000 responses. So I'm curious how many comments they actually read. I don't know how he would go over that in this video.
so I'm super excited to share some of what we learned.
Yeah, what have you learned?
So first off, the level of engagement was through the roof. Over 40,000 people engaged with the survey, about 39,000 completed the whole thing. And so first, I want to say thank you to everybody.
Okay, so I was wrong. 40,000 people didn't complete the survey. It sounds like 39,000 completed it, 40,000 started it, and I guess about 1,000 of them gave up halfway through.
Who filled out that survey. I know it can take some time to do it. It's invaluable for us. We not only look at all the scores, we dig into what people have written. This really helps us get a sense of where does the community want D&D to go next. So again, big thanks to everyone who participated. And it was a ton of people who participated, which means the satisfaction scores that we have are quite persuasive given how many people participated. So first, how about I tell you the thing that scored the highest?
Yeah, I'm very curious.
In the whole UA. So the thing that's...
I figure I should do a guess here. And my guess would be the first level feat. That would in with backgrounds. That would be my guess.
Scored the highest, almost reaching 90% satisfaction, was getting a first level feat in your background.
Score!
This is a great example of a kind of experimental thing that we will sometimes put out there. Way back for the D&D Next playtest, an example of an experimental thing where we truly weren't sure how the audience was going to respond was the advantage and disadvantage mechanic, which are now a core part of the game because fan satisfaction was so high. I frankly expected fans to be satisfied with getting a first level feat in their background. What I did not expect is that the satisfaction would be this high.
I mean, who doesn't like free things? So.
Well, again, it was an open question because, some groups prefer not to use feats, which
It is the one rule in that where everyone I engaged with liked the idea of getting a first level feat.
is one of the reasons why we're very carefully threading this needle of, all right, you get this free one, so we're not going to require you to engage with the feat system repeatedly unless you really want to, but we also want to give you that taste so that you can then make an informed decision about whether or not you later engage with feats. Feats also, as you and I have chatted before about, are a great way for us to communicate some concrete things that each background is good at. So I'm excited to see how much the community is embracing getting a feat as a part of a character's background. Here's the thing. That scored super high.
Right.
What was amazing is almost everything did. So the majority of the things in this Unearthed Arcana scored 80% or higher. So before I go any further about
That's a little surprising because overall I liked the playtest, but I did have some things, like some of the feats I thought were bad. I'm trying to remember. There was one, a crafting feat, I thought was terrible. So I'm curious. He says almost everything did really well. I gotta assume there's got to be an exception here for critical hits. There's no way people like critical hits.
the scores of specific things, I think it's important to talk about what do the numbers themselves mean.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this at length. So usually 70% or higher, right?
Yep, 70% or higher is what we're looking for. When something scores in the 70s, we see that as the community giving a thumbs up, but that also means there's still some tinkering for us to do. Sometimes very minor tinkering or moderate tinkering. But the core message is the community is saying, yes, more of this. As soon as a score hits 80% or higher, now we're going into the realm of not only does the community want more of that, but they want exactly that. So what that means for us as a design team is when we look at a thing that gets 80% satisfaction or higher, we then tread very carefully in our further development to make sure we don't change it too much. It might still be changed in minor ways for balance reasons, for cohesion reasons, making sure the different parts of the game are functioning well together. But as soon as you're into that 80% area, or even more especially if you make it into the 90s, that is basically the community saying, yes, this.
So what he's saying here is that if most of the stuff in the One D&D playtest, the first one, the background packet, that most of it got 80% or higher, and he's saying if it gets 80% or higher, we don't want to change it very much, then I would expect that most of the stuff we saw in the first playtest is going to reach the official version with, what did he say? He said minor tweaks to make things fit in. But that's what he's saying. Now, my issue with how they're getting their feedback and responding to it is, and I've mentioned this when I was filling out the surveys, is that this lacks context. It's hard to say whether you agree with something when we don't know the rest of the game yet. So, do I like this in... one of the things that I mentioned for an example is the critical hits. I thought, if you put it under sneak attack, that it doubles if you roll a 20, and you put it under these other things, then, the way they change critical hits might be fine, but we just don't know enough yet to actually respond. So I wonder how many of these things people are satisfied with because it's like, well, I'm probably satisfied, but I'm not sure. And then they put in a comment and then he looks and says, "Oh, 80%. Great, we'll keep it as is." I'm curious. I think there's some nuance that's lost in that kind of response.
Now, when we go below 70, when we're in the 60s, something in the 60s we consider to be salvageable, that there are enough people interested in the thing that maybe there's something there for us to save, but we need to really reconsider many aspects of the design. Anything that scores below 60%, like when we're in the 50s, good chance we're not going to do anything with it. And if it's in the 40s and below, it's pretty much gone. It got dusted by the community cast disintegrate on it, and the dust is there. Now,
never to be spoken of again.
Yeah. Now, I have to say, it is extremely rare for anything to be in that category. Most things that we send out in Unearthed Arcana end up in the sort of 60, 70, and 80 range. It's really rare for something to hit into the 50s, and even rarer for something to be lower than that. But again, what was remarkable when we got the scores back for this UA is how many things were 80% or higher. And again, the first level feat was at 87%. So again, inching toward 90% satisfaction, which is a ringing endorsement for that piece of design. Would you like to hear about some other scores?
I would love to. I'm curious what's low? What was low?
So, yeah, that's a great question and easy to address because so little was low. So first off, nothing was in the 50s or below. We had, among the various main options, there were only 3 things that dipped into the 60s.
So that means that the critical hit changes, and then 1s being automatic failures and 20s being automatic successes, all that stuff had most people satisfied with it, and that's a bit of a surprise to me. Now, again, I didn't have a big problem with the 1s and 20s thing, as I mentioned in the video where I filled out the survey. But I'm just know anecdotally what I have from conversations with people, and most people I talked to didn't like either of those things.
So one of those was the D20 test rule that was in the rules glossary. Was not a surprise to us. Yeah. You and I talked when we introduced that, highly experimental.
Yeah.
I didn't actually expect what we were doing there with the a 1 for all D20 tests being a failure, a 20 for all D20 tests being a success, the way critical...
Well, good news is, since it obviously was a standout for being lowly or poorly received, that you will likely not see natural 1s being a automatic failure and natural 20s being an automatic success in the final rules.
Hits were working. You and I talked about it.
Yeah.
Highly experimental, which often in our conversations in these videos, when I say that, that means I won't be surprised if it doesn't make it. But the thing is we often like to do what's called A/B testing. We like to present 2 very different versions of something and then compare the community's response to them. Which is why in the very next Unearthed Arcana, before we'd even delved into the feedback for the first one, we presented a different version of the D20 test rule. And I am expecting, once the survey closes for the expert classes UA, that we'll see a very different score for the D20 test. So again, the D20 test rule being in the 60s, not a surprise.
Well, was there anything that was a surprise?
No. Other than, okay, there is one surprise here so only again, 3 things that were in the 60s. The surprise is about the next 2, about their relative relationships to each other in the 60s. So the other 2 things that were in the 60% range were the Ardling and the Dragonborn. And the big...
Okay, So the Dragonborn doesn't surprise me. The Dragonborn, I had forgotten about it until he just mentioned it. But the Dragonborn was really weak, like really, really weak. I'm a little surprised to see the Ardling did so poorly. I didn't think it was a bad race. It kind of had. I guess part of the reason probably is a lot of people saw it and they thought, "What's the point of this race? We already have Asimars. They kind of have the same theme. It wasn't exact, but it was close enough that they didn't see the point in having another, celestially touched type of race. So maybe that was it.
Surprise here is the Dragonborn scored lower than the Ardling.
Oh.
So I was ready for the Ardling, which was totally new. Really, it was just ta-da!
Okay, I'm surprised that he was surprised because the thing is they redid Dragonborn, so they did variants of Dragonborns in Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, and everyone seems to love those. I personally love them. I've played them. I think they're good races. And Dragonborns, up to then, we generally discarded because they just weren't very good. And it was shocking to me that in the One D&D playtest that they reverted the breath weapon to be more like the Player's Handbook version. I just did not understand that change at all. I am really surprised that he figured that wouldn't get a significant response.
Here's a brand new option.
Yeah.
Anytime we do that, we are prepared for response to be all over the map. So it's really hard to...
Oh, and I should just add in, the good news is, since he has now been surprised that we're not a fan of crappy Dragonborn, then we should expect some new versions. So hopefully the next shot at the Dragonborn will go better.
Surprise us with, whether it's super, approving or super disapproving, totally new things, always a big question mark over them. And so we're prepared for essentially any response. What surprised us was that the Dragonborn, which is well established in the game, scored lower than the Ardling. And they were both in the 60s, so that means they're both salvageable. But we then need to dig into what needs to happen next. And people are going to get to see what's going to happen next in our next Unearthed Arcana,
right,
which will include new versions of both the Ardling and the Dragonborn.
Easy, Jeremy. Just take your Dragonborn from Fizban's and, take the 3 versions and then have those 3 versions as options in the next Player's Handbook. And my bet is that 60-ish% satisfaction rate jumps at least up into the 70s or 80s.
Now, I can tell you now, and maybe in our video for that UA we can dig a little deeper, I can tell you now that as we dug into the written responses about the Ardling and the Dragonborn, I can sum up pretty easily why we think both of those options landed in the 60s. For the Dragonborn, it's really simple. It's the breath weapon.
Yeah.
There was dissatisfaction about the implementation of the breath weapon, so we are addressing that head on in the next version.
Great.
There was also some confusion in the feedback about the relationship of this new version of the Dragonborn to the Dragonborn options that appear in Fizban's Treasury of Dragons.
Right.
And so this is a great time for me to clarify that whatever new version of something we present in the 2024 Player's Handbook can stand alongside options like those that appear in Fizban's Treasury of Dragons. You can really...
So what he's saying is he doesn't want to just copy those because then that material becomes obsolete. Okay, but at least copy the breath weapon. Like, you give it something else. Like in Fizban's, there's 3 categories. You can be a chromatic, metallic, or gem Dragonborn, and then each of them get something in addition to their breath weapon. And So just have a Dragonborn that is more generic, but it has something separate in addition to the breath weapon we saw in Fizban's. I mean, the breath weapon they presented in 1D&D, it was one of the more disappointing things in that whole document.
Think of the player's handbook Dragonborn as sort of being the universal Dragonborn, whereas the Dragonborn options in Fizban's are very intentionally more targeted, specifically a metallic Dragonborn, a chromatic Dragonborn, a gem Dragonborn. Those options can be played alongside the more universal Dragonborn that would appear in a core book.
Right.
So again, people are going to get to see a whole new take on the Dragonborn in the next UA, including also a new, fun 5th level ability that kicks in for that universal Dragonborn. But we can talk about that in our next video.
You can't just tease.
Yes, I am a dungeon master at heart, and part of being a DM is cliffhangers. So
guest time, they can grow wings for 10 minutes, proficiency bonus times per long rest at 5th level, or will it be once per long rest? Probably once per long rest at 5th level. That would be my guess.
Next time we'll talk about,
which is essentially what the Gem Dragonborn gets, except they don't get the wings. That would be my guess.
about that.
That's frustrating. Okay.
So the Ardling, here also, once we dug into the written feedback, it was pretty clear what was going on, and I really loved the feedback we got, and that was that the Ardling was trying to do a few too many things. It was sort of both being a sort of a cousin to the Aasimar, which, by the way, we saw some questions of, is the Ardling replacing the Aasimar?
Right.
Definitely not. The Aasimar is still in the game. The Aasimar is in Monsters of the Multiverse. But again, there was this sense that it was sort of being a cousin to the Aasimar while also being a beast person. And we saw much more interest in the feedback in the Ardling of leaning into the beast person side.
Right.
And so in the whole new take of the Ardling and the next Unearthed Arcana, people are going to see that its identity is much clearer. It's the place it's filling in the multiverse, I think is definitely going to come into focus for people.
Okay, so it sounds like they're maybe dispensing or at least muting the celestial portion or thematics of the Ardling and going all in, and this is some kind of beast race, I guess. I guess we'll see.
I have seen it. It's cool.
That's right, you have read it. So that's it. It was just those 3 things. Everything else was scored in the 70s or the 80s. And
That's also an amazing amount of playtesters.
yes, yeah, the number of playtesters of, again, 39,000 people.
That's a misnomer. Not 39,000 playtesters. 39,000 people filled out the survey, and I would bet that most of them never actually playtested a thing. They just read it and they're giving their comments.
Completing the survey is remarkable. And that's what I said, that means these scores are persuasive. And I'll give a few more that I think will be fascinating to people.
Okay, yeah.
For as long as I've been working on the game, over multiple editions.
Oh, and it just hit me right now. He said there were 3 things that scored under 70. He says that it was the tests having the natural 1s and 20s as failures and successes, the Ardling, and the Dragonborn. He did not mention critical hits. That is shocking.
The human is the most played. Now, the one bit that was very satisfying to me here that was a bit of a surprise was just how much people like this new take on the human. And so, yeah, the new human scored 83%.
Wow.
Followed by 4 options that basically were virtually tied. The dwarf, the orc, the tiefling, and the elf all were basically virtually tied hovering around 80 and 81%.
I like Tremor Sense a lot. For dwarf.
Yeah, and then the other two options, I mean, we've now talked about all of them except for the gnome and the halfling, and even the gnome and the halfling scored really well, tied at 78%. So a lot of excitement and positivity about these options, but also some great notes in the written feedback that we are analyzing and will incorporate into future versions of these options. And again, people are going to get to see a new Ardling and a new Dragonborn in our very next UA.
So what are we seeing for future installments of UA right now for One D&D playtest?
So in our next one, we have not only the new Ardling and the new Dragonborn, as well as a surprise guest, which we'll talk about also in our next video, but also we have a new version of the Cleric. And this UA will be a little shorter than our others. We've realized that the first two were really chunky. And so
they were big.
This one is
was
still
huge.
big, but a little smaller. Then the next one after that's going to get bigger again. And we will continue our journey through the classes. So of course we have still to go the Druid and the Paladin to accompany the Cleric in the Priest group. And then we have the Warrior group and also the Mage group.
The Warrior group is the one I was hoping would be in the next Unearthed Arcana, because I think we really need to know what they're doing with those kinds of classes. So a little disappointed to hear that we're going to be waiting a while for them.
Ahead of us. One of the things I am super excited about when we get to the Warrior group UA is that's when we're going to dig deep into something I teased in the previous UA. In the previous UA, there's a sidebar that talks about what's ahead for the One D&D playtest. And one of the options that I saw online, some people did notice, is new weapon options for certain types of characters. Here's what that means. We are going to be unveiling with the new versions of the Warrior groups whole new ways to use weapons.
So one of those things we're going to dive into is going to be kind of your home base.
Yeah, in the most recent UA, in that little preview of what's ahead, one of the things mentioned is there'll be new rules on managing your character's home base. This is going to be a new subsystem that DMs and players can decide to whether they're going to implement it in their campaign or not. And if they do decide to, they're going to be able to create home bases with NPCs connected with them that end up implementing a number of our current downtime rules in the context of your home base and your group of NPCs. And that system we call the Bastion system. And next year we're going to unveil what you're going to be able to do with that should your campaign adopt it.
I'm very excited for this.
I am too. We've had tons of fun planning it out. But before we get there, we're focusing on the core character options of the game, especially character classes, which means we also have, in the end, there will be a total of 48 subclasses that will appear in this playtest process, 4 for each of the game's 12 classes. We also are going to share with DMs.
Okay, that is a big piece of information. So we already knew about the 48 subclasses. And, I mentioned when he said that, well, we already have like over 40 subclasses. So it's not that many new ones. But he's saying 4 subclasses per class. That means that clerics and wizards, which previously had way over 4 each, I don't remember the exact number, it's like 10 and 9 or something like that, they're each going to have 4 now. That is a bit of a, well, more than a bit, that's a big surprise.
New encounter building rules aimed at making it easier to prep, and even more monster customization options, things that will make it easier for DMs to run this game. And so there is a whole lot ahead of us. Also mixed in will be new versions of things that appear in the playtest, because a critical part of this is we send things out, we get feedback, things that didn't score particularly well, we do new versions, we send those out, we get feedback on that. It's a process that is already bearing fruit. The feedback that people have given is already improving what's going on here, both at the macro level with things like the Dragonborn and the Ardling, but also on the micro level, because since we dig into the written feedback that is provided, people are already telling us great things about wording in the rules glossary, for instance, that might be unclear to them. And so that's the playtest process working. We read it like, aha, we will improve this, meaning that when we get finally to the books in a couple of years, we will have been able to refine the wording of the rules, the character options, the DM options, incorporating feedback from tens of thousands of people.
And that's, I mean, this is very clear why it's so important for everyone to play test it and then give that feedback, because it's clearly changing the process as we go.
Absolutely. And it's even valuable to us if, say, a person doesn't have time to play test. It's still valuable for us to get feedback on the survey just based on the person's reading of the material. Because we can tell when we're reading if feedback is based on real play experience versus first impression on reading. Feedback from both situations is helpful to us. And so I encourage people, if you've at least read it, please fill out the survey. Even better if you've read it and you've tried some of it out in play, because we find all of our perceptions change once we get to the game table and we're rolling dice. But again, all of the feedback is helpful.
This is something that's come up a bit with the playtest material. If there is something absent, like the use object action or like Eldritch Blast, does that mean that that's not going to exist?
So that is a great question. And what I think is important to
asking
understand about the playtest is we're presenting a version of something and asking what people think of it with the assumption that if something doesn't appear in the playtest, it's still in the game. So people have rightly noticed that the Eldritch Blast spell has not appeared on any of the spell lists thus far. Eldritch Blast has not been removed from the game. It just simply means it's not on those spell lists.
You know, the assumption we're making is that it's going to be a class feature of the Warlock, but it doesn't sound like he's confirming or denying that here.
When we get to the Mage Unearthed Arcana, people will get to see what we're doing with Eldritch Blast in the Warlock. Similarly, the use an object action, and actually several actions have not appeared yet in the glossary for the playtest. What that means is we're still using the action as it's defined in the 2014 Player's Handbook, because typically we put things in the glossary only if we've changed the definition in some way, or if it's something that was never fully defined in the 2014 Player's Handbook. Because there are a few rules that didn't appear in the 2014 Player's Handbook, but did appear in the Monster Manual or Dungeon Master's Guide. And essentially our test is, if it didn't appear in the PH, and we want people to test it in the playtest, we put it into the glossary. Similarly, if we've changed it in some way, it goes into the glossary. That means if it's not there,
don't panic.
It is still in the game until we say it isn't.
Right.
Now, people have rightly noticed that the Thief subclass in the previous UA doesn't, as a part of their cunning action enhancement, interact with the use an object action anymore. That's intentional. That wasn't an accidental omission. We removed it from that feature because in the 2014 version of the feature, it fell into an area of mechanics that we sometimes refer to as Mother May I mechanics. And what we mean by that is something that is on your character sheet that really only works if the DM cooperates with you in its execution.
Right.
This is as opposed to most of the features that characters have where you can reliably just use it and it does what it says on the description of the feature.
Right.
And we have found that in general, those sorts of mechanics that kind of require DM permission or buy-in to function properly often end up being unsatisfying, or they end up slowing down the game. And so, for instance, what the thief could actually do with that bonus action, use an object action, caused endless questions, partly because we weren't clear enough in the 2014 rules everything about what all is encompassed by use an object, because we tell you, well, you can use an object with it, but not a magic item, and it's not entirely clear how the equipment in the equipment chapter interacts with that action. All of that is on our list to clear up in this playtest process. But specifically for the thief, we didn't want that to be a part of that feature anymore.
Right.
Now, might the use an object action go away? It might. I'll be upfront about that. But we haven't decided yet. And that will be a decision we come to through the playtest process. And so again, if something is actually going to be removed from the game, we will say so. So again, if it's not present, it just means it's not in the playtest yet, or we're happy with its 2014 implementation.
The journalist in me wants to ask about wild magic sorcery now. Speaking of Mother, may I have a wild surge?
And you can expect when we get to the mage classes, and specifically to the sorcerer, we're going to address that. And you also saw in the previous Unearthed Arcana that we addressed that in the Ranger. Because one of the main issues with especially the Ranger's first level features in the 2014 Player's Handbook is they relied way too heavily on DM buy-in. That if your DM really bought into how they functioned, your Ranger could feel at first level super effective and later on feel like you had something to contribute that others didn't.
Right.
But if your DM didn't buy in, you could end up with a situation where you felt like those features didn't even exist in terms of actual play.
Right.
And they were bad. Bad features. Like, even if you had DM buy-in, they tended to be skip challenge features rather than contribute to challenge features.
And so we've addressed that in the Ranger. Luckily, that isn't an issue for most of the features in the game, but when we come across them, we want to make sure one of our design goals is if you've got a class feature, you should be able to use it in the way you expect. Now, that still leaves things open for the DM to introduce in the environment, in the cosmos, something strange that alters how things work. But that's a story thing, and that's totally within the DM's purview. That's different from the feature itself basically telling you, well, if the DM buys in, you'll get to use this.
Yeah. Another question that's really common is great weapon fighting and sharpshooter. Mm-hmm. So these feats have damage bonuses, many of which people enjoy, with a little bit more risk-reward kind of action in their mechanics. Why was that changed?
So, yeah, in the 2014 versions
we're
of those
super
two
interested in
feats,
this.
they had the damage bonus that you talked about. That was sort of counterbalanced with a penalty to your to-hit roll that you would adopt. Here's the issue. First off, the penalty to the to-hit roll, especially at higher levels, is not actually big enough to justify that large of a damage bonus. It becomes very easy as you progress to make that -5 to your attack roll trivial. But then there's an even bigger issue. We want our warrior classes in particular to be able to rely on their class features, which, remember, are going to include some of these awesome new weapon options. We want them to be able to rely on those for their main damage output.
That is I'm hopeful. I am hopeful. That sounds really good. If the the damage bonuses from Great Weapon Master and Sharpshooter are gone, but they're being replaced with ways to enhance your damage in hopefully similar fashions within the warrior classes themselves, thus actually creating a situation where the warriors have something unique to enhance damage of weapons that non-warriors don't have. That would be fantastic. So he didn't outright say enough there to celebrate yet, but there's definitely hope that it sounds like there's going to be class feature stuff in the warrior classes that are going to help replace the fact that we don't have the -5/+10 options anymore in Sharpshooter and Great Weapon Master. And if that's the case, I'm thrilled. My main concern is the stuff you're going to put in those warrior classes good enough to replace those things? So that, I guess, we have yet to see.
We do not want any feats to feel like you have to take them to be dealing a satisfying amount of damage.
100%.
So really the issue with those two feats was twofold. Again, it was too easy to make the penalty to the 2-hit roll trivial, and those two feats with those really enticing damage bonuses in them almost became must-haves. And that for us violates our design goal for feats, which is we always want you to feel good about the feats you took, but we don't want you to feel like you must take particular feats to hit a baseline level of whether it's damage output, or if you're a healer, the amount of healing you do, or if you're an expert and you're much more about versatility. We want you to go to feats because there's a particular angle you want to accentuate, not because you feel like I've got to take this feat to even be able to show up and do my job.
So I've been harping on must-have options, especially in my videos over the last couple months, because it just bothers me more and more that we have these things that you just have to have. And Great Weapon Master and Sharpshooter are fantastic examples of that, where we have parties that it's all the weapons are hand crossbows and polearms. So I am thrilled to hear this. This basically, he's parroting my feelings on this matter 100%. So this has been my favorite part of the video so far, just to hear him say that.
So fear not, people who love playing warriors. There is juicy stuff coming in the classes themselves. And that's where we want you to be able to turn reliably to some options where you will be dishing out the damage. And again, that's one of the reasons why I'm really looking forward to when we release that UA.
So there's another one. There's the light weapon property and having to do with bonus actions. Are we going to see other changes like this, and why was this changed?
So the light weapon property, we really amped it up by removing the bonus action requirement. It's now you get this extra attack simply as a part of the attack action.
Is that because of the threading of everything going through a bonus action?
Yes, because, and I think we might have talked about this in our video about this UA, requiring light weapon users to use their bonus action to get that extra attack meant that there were a lot of bad combinations with class features that also required bonus actions, spells that required bonus actions. It meant that people who really like the fantasy of, fighting with two light weapons were sort of having to pay attacks that other weapon users were not having to pay. And so that's why we made that change, because we noticed over time that tax on light weapon use was actually causing us to sort of distort design decisions elsewhere. Like, we started flinching away from using the bonus action in a few cases, even though the bonus action was the most natural design choice, because then we're like, well, but then this will be rough for people who are using light weapons. So the playtest is a time for us where we can find how about we just fix the light weapon property so that it stops causing these ripples in the design
And that
environment.
was a great
so
change.
That a light weapon user can use these other options just as well as somebody else. So when, again, we get to the warrior classes and we explore the new weapon options, we're also going to explore possibly tweaking some of the other weapon properties. But our focus is going to be more on these brand new options. And again, we'll talk more about that in the months ahead.
Another one of these things that came up was class spell lists. Are these going away forever?
That's an open question. So our focus right now is getting everyone used to the 3 big spell lists: the arcane list, the primal list, and the divine list. Now, in the expert classes UA, we saw the bard and the ranger interacting with those lists, but with some sort of exceptions. Each of them could pick only certain spells from whatever list they were going to. And we've definitely seen the feedback that for those 2 classes, it would be nice if they still had a class list that basically summarized.
They are reading comments, so that's great. So whenever they say, "Oh, we read the comments," there's always a bit of skepticism. How many did you actually read? But I talked to so many people, and I certainly felt this myself, that if you're choosing your ranger spells and then you're going through the primal list, then you got to look and see, okay, so what school is that, and then cross-reference it. Why not just create the list of, which spells are available? And you can explain the design intent. It's all the spells from the primal list of these schools. Great. But just give us the short list that makes it easier for us to select our spells. And I know I put that in the comments, and I'm certain lots of people did, and they read it. I'm so far very glad about the things I'm hearing in this video.
What they can pick from the master list. We're definitely open to doing that. But what we really wanted to do is focus initially on showing people sort of how they get their spells from the master list. And we will definitely, as we build the books, look at ways to make the spell selection process even easier. And there's a good chance that will mean, like, the bard will have just a list that simply compiles all the spells that the bard can choose from.
Right.
Now, there are going to be other classes, though, where that won't be necessary. And people are going to see that in the cleric, because the cleric can simply choose from the entire divine spell list. You're going to see that also with the wizard, who can choose from the entire arcane list. So it's going to...
Notice he didn't say sorcerer. The wizard is going to have access to the entire, arcane list. But the sorcerer, he didn't mention. So I wonder what schools they won't be able to do. Conjuration would be my guess.
To be a class-by-class decision we make, and it will really come down to, is it too much of a headache to go through the list and then manually, as a player, exclude certain schools? And I could definitely see that being a pain, in which case we are likely to give that class its own list that, again, is really just a summary of what's available to them from the master list. But then if a class like the cleric or the wizard can choose from an entire list, there'll be no need for us to have a class-specific list for them. This, by the way, is a part of the philosophy we've had all along for 5th edition. And that is, we're always looking to do what is right for a particular class. So what works for the bard may not work for the wizard. What works for the cleric may not work for the druid. And so we will, especially as we transition from this playtest and development process into building the actual books, look at making sort of user interface decisions that make the life of the players who play each class as friction-free as possible.
Has this been exciting for you? Because like 5th edition has, was around so long, and we've got 1D&D, taking, this building off of that. Like there must have been stuff like you start picking up on year over year that you're like, oh, if only we could tweak it.
Well, it is super exciting for me because I love this game. I love the game we've all been playing together for the last 8 years. But there are also things that I know could be faster, have more options, be clearer, have fewer places where you feel forced to make certain decisions. And so we're now able to address all of that through this process, continuing the conversation that we started with the D&D community, back with the D&D Next playtest process. And yeah, I am jazzed that we are going to continue this conversation for more than a year ahead of us. And that I think is a great note to end on today, is just to invite everyone to buckle in. This is going to be a long conversation.
Yeah.
We're going to see different versions of things. If you spot something that's unclear, that's not resonating with you, please let us know in the survey, because we're reading your feedback. We're already making improvements based on it. That is the process working as intended. It's meant to be a back and forth that will result in new versions of the core books that all of us as a community can be excited about.
So we really appreciate the comments, and we appreciate any commentary on social media as
that's
well.
Basically the end. But I do want to say, what a great video. Like, wow. I saw this, and this is the first time I've seen it. 1D&D survey results, and I'm like, okay, they're going to tell us some results of the surveys, which they did in the very beginning of the video. And then they spent the rest of the video talking about design philosophy, the design intent, rules clarity, addressing must-have options. I was really, really impressed with what I just saw. Boy, does that give me a lot of hope. Obviously, we have to actually see the results rather than relying on these promises. But boy, am I so glad to hear this stuff. I wrote a letter to Jeremy Crawford that I talked about a number of things, and I don't know whether it was read or not, but I will say a number of the things I asked in the letter are addressed here. So if you did read it, thank you so much for reading it and responding. And if you didn't read it, well, maybe you don't need to anymore, because it sounds like we might be on the same page. So, wow. Yeah, that was a great video. So thanks, everyone. I'm probably myself going to stop this video right now and go back and watch that again because I was super impressed by it. Anyway, yeah, good news. All right. Good day. And thank you all for watching. And until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and watch this video again. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.